Hello. Last week, two professors of the Holocaust came here to Fletcher to share knowledge with middle school. This video contains sensitive information. Viewer discretion is advised. Thank you for watching. Hello, and I'm here with...
Max's dad.
So, Dad, what's the Holocaust and why is it important?
Well, the Holocaust refers to the persecution of Jews and other victim groups like Roma and Sinti, the disabled, or the LGBTQ community, for example, who initiated by Nazi Germany,
Yeah.
and then also perpetrated by their allies. Targeted these groups
Yeah.
for removal from society and their extermination.
So, how do you think people could have gotten away with such things? Like, if you had a Jewish neighbor, how could you just let them take Jews away?
Well, I think there are a couple of different factors that are involved. I think one has to do with the incrementalism that we see taking place. I think another very important aspect has to do with what I think some people refer to as social death, which is to say that the Nazi regime wanted the German public to view Jews and other groups as not human, as fundamentally other or different, not worthy of the rights and dignities that we typically accord to our fellow humans. And not even that, but to also see them as threats, as enemies that had to be removed from society, and to encourage Germans to ostracize them.
Yes.
Through the passages of laws, for example, propaganda, etc.
So they got away with this by making them seem like an enemy. And so instead of just letting them take the Jews away, they wanted to make them try to force them away, view them as the German enemy.
Well, for example, there was a board game that was designed for children to play that encouraged German kids to remove the Jews from their district. That was the game. It was called Juden raus, or Jews out. Children were playing this game, and it was encouraging them to think of this as a good thing.
So it was just like, it wasn't even hiding. It was like much in your face, we want the Jews to go away.
Yes.
They were, and at a very young age, they're being indoctrinated.
Yes, and that propaganda was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. It was in schools, it was in the movie theaters, it was in the newspapers, it was on the radio, it was plastered onto the walls of the workplace, for example. In some churches, sadly, you could hear it in the sermons. So it really was everywhere. You couldn't escape it.
And before the Jews were killed, which I'll obviously ask about, and of course other groups, what rights were taken away from other groups? And of course Jews, but was there other groups that were rights to be taken away?
Well, yes. So, for example, there were laws that were passed by the Nazi regime that essentially made it illegal to be a member of the LGBT community, and they were heavily persecuted. In addition, the Nuremberg laws, which in 1935 were passed initially targeting Jews, a Nazi judge later ruled that those same laws would apply to Roma and Sinti as well.
So no bike, no entertainment, obviously no weapons, or basically...
Well, no weapons, no, certainly not. But they were restricted severely in the public sphere. Yeah.
And like, how was the leap between no bike to no life? Like, what was like the leap between I can't go to the movie theaters to I'm going to die?
Well, again, you have this increasing campaign led by the state, right, to further stigmatize and ostracize German Jews, to dehumanize them, right? And in 1938, as I'm sure you
Yes.
are aware, right, you have this pivotal moment, Kristallnacht, right,
Yes.
the Night of Broken Glass, and that's used as the pretext to begin this mass deportation of Jews to concentration camps.
Yeah, do you think so Kristallnacht, for those who do not know, was the night when the Nazi government organized basically a big mob against Jews that would burn down synagogues, destroy Jewish businesses, and other such destruction of anything that they deemed Semitic.
Yeah, so for that 24-hour period, you saw ordinary Germans looting Jewish businesses, burning down synagogues, Jewish cultural centers. Jews were attacked in the streets. It was really horrific.
And so, was that kind of like a test to see how far Germans would go?
Yes, actually it was. When Kristallnacht was underway, the German or the Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, were making notes about what the reaction was of the German public.
So like if they took a bike away from Jews, they thought, well, what if they react? But since they didn't, they thought, well, what if now we can take away rights to movie theaters and more and more and more?
Well, sure, they were taking the temperature of the German public the entire time after the Nazis came into power. But on Kristallnacht, what the Gestapo reported to Hitler and what he learned from that experience was that ordinary Germans didn't necessarily like seeing open displays of violence, especially playing out just outside their kitchen window.
Yeah.
They didn't like the anarchy and the destruction because they were afraid it could spread to their own homes and businesses. But insofar as the physical removal of Jews from German society and the deportation to concentration camps, that evoked far less criticism. And so that signaled to Hitler that he could be more aggressive on that front.
And so after Kristallnacht, you could start seeing ghettos and eventually concentration camps.
Well, the ghettos get created after the invasion of Poland, right? And not immediately. There's this very brief phase where it's not really clear what exactly the policy is going to be, but eventually they do start creating ghettos where they concentrate Poland's Jewish populations into neighborhoods and cities. But the German Jews, immediately after Kristallnacht, the men, I should say, right, they were deported to, at that point in time, a concentration camp in Germany, because that's before, right, the invasion of Poland. That was Dachau.
And in concentrations like Dachau and Auschwitz, which you have mentioned is kind of a rare version of a concentration camp. So what were the two different types?
There are several different types of concentration camps. You have labor camps, you have transit camps that essentially are holding places as people were transported from one place to another. You have political camps. The origins of Auschwitz as a concentration camp was as a camp for political prisoners from Poland. And then it later became primarily a labor and death camp. And then, of course, death camps are what we most associate with the Holocaust. And Auschwitz was somewhat unique in that it was a labor camp and a death camp.
Yeah. So now that they kind of started popping up the concentration camps, were people against seeing them? And we can see from Kristallnacht that people were against Jews, but were they fine with their true extermination, or I guess not extermination, but removal to the extent?
Insofar as what the civilian public knew, right, about what was happening in concentration camps, the death camps, all of those were in Poland, right? So that is not something that German civilians would have observed firsthand. In terms of other concentration camps where the conditions were horrendous, I mean, the public was kept at some room. But, rumors would circulate after this had been going on for a number of years. It was hard to completely suppress that information. But I'll give you an interesting example.
Yes.
I think during the presentation that the 7th and 8th graders watched, there was a reference to the persecution of the disabled, right?
Yes. Yes.
So that was part of a program that was called T4. And the disabled Germans who were persecuted under that program were gassed, many of them, and their bodies burned. And those centers were located in municipalities. And so when the crematoria were operating, people could smell, right, that very, very unpleasant, very distinct odor. And it was, very difficult to deny
That there were.
what was happening. And there was, one of, I think, the lessons about looking at the T4 program is that because so many German families were getting letters in the mail saying their family members had mysteriously died of pneumonia, and they couldn't see the bodies, they couldn't retrieve the bodies, and the telltale sign of the crematoria operating, right? The German public began to realize what was happening and demanded that the government stop. And with that public pressure campaign, led, for example, by some German priests, the Nazi regime, more or less said, okay, we're sorry, this got out of hand and we're going to stop. Now, they didn't ever actually completely stop, but they slowed it down significantly. And what that shows you is that when the German public really applied pressure, right, the Nazi regime backs down. So it begs the question then, what would have happened, for example, during Kristallnacht, if the German public had exercised that same degree of condemnation and outrage, right? What would have happened differently as a result?
And one last question. What's the big takeaway of the Holocaust?
That is a really good question. I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn, but to me, I think the most important takeaway is that it's very easy to demonize and ostracize others, but when we see that happening in society, we have a responsibility to speak out against it and to support those who are being persecuted.
Thank you, turn.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Hello, I'm right here with.
Hi, my name is Katie Cunningham. I am the Assistant Director of the Stan Greenspan Holocaust Education Center at Queen's University.
So I'm going to ask you about the Holocaust. Now, and more specifically, what do people do about it when the Holocaust is taking place? Because most people would think that, well, nothing happened, it kind of just was let happen, but that's not true, is it?
So let me make sure I understand your question. What was the general population's reaction while this was happening at that time period?
Yeah, and also just more was there any resistance towards it?
Right, so there were definitely, as today when something happens, lots of people respond differently. And there was a small group of people at the time that did feel like the right reaction was to resist. They were able to look at what was happening and with their own moral judgment basically said, this is not okay, and I'm going to do something about it. And if we look at the record that Yad Vashem has, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, they have over 28,000 individuals or nations listed as righteous among the nations. So these were non-Jewish people who went out of their way and risked their lives to save Jewish people.
And how would some of these people achieve saving a Jew? An ordinary person like me, or a priest, or etc. How would I save a Jew?
So there were different forms of resistance, and there was Jewish resistance, there was non-Jewish resistance. So we looked at earlier today this idea of spiritual resistance.
Yeah.
But if we're going to specifically look at non-Jewish people and how they were able to be upstanders, there was offering aid, there was rescuing or hiding neighbors. There was smuggling goods to them so they could have an armed resistance. All no matter what way someone stood up for a Jewish person, they were facing danger to them and their families.
Yeah, and now to go back on to Jewish resistance, if I were Jew, how would I make sure that I do not get deported? How would I fight back against these people who are essentially trying to take me away?
Right. So as a non-Jewish person sitting here today in 2025, there's no way that I can fully understand what it meant to be a Jewish person and be in that situation. So I can't speak to that mindset. No one can really, other than our survivors. But can you clarify your question one more time for me?
So, if I was Jewish, how would I rebel?
Okay, so specific to if you made the decision as a Jewish person to resist, what that might look like.
Yeah.
So like I said, everybody had a different mindset. Some people thought that the safest thing to do was to be quiet and that things would get better. So we can't judge people who made that decision. But there were others that decided, I'm going to resist, whether spiritually, I'm going to continue to practice my Judaism, I'm going to continue to be proud of who I am. Or there were those that decided to be in the armed resistance, and everybody had to react to their own personal situation in whichever capacity they had.
What can you take away and apply in modern day from lessons of the Holocaust? And also, what can you take away and apply from the people who did rebel from that courage?
So when we learn about the Holocaust, we are learning educational values from an event in history that was never meant to be educational. So we need to start at that basis, right? So we are learning from something that was never meant to be something that we were supposed to look at and learn these great lessons from.
Yeah.
But we can look back at the atrocities and use that to inform our behavior today.
Yeah.
So if I had to break this down to just a few lessons that we should take away from it, the first thing is that anti-Semitism is wrong.
Yes, I mean that's
That should
basic.
be common sense. Unfortunately, that's not the reality of our situation today. We've seen a 400% increase in the United States in anti-Semitism in the last 15 months. So that is a lesson. Anti-Semitism did not end with the Holocaust. It is still a problem today, and it's just simply wrong. We shouldn't hate any group of people for who they are. So that would be lesson number one. Lesson number two would be that when we see injustices happening, we can do things as individuals to make an impact. We can use our voice. We can make decisions. We can protect groups that are being targeted, and we should, because we can see what from Holocaust history, we can see what happens when someone in a position of power is left unchecked by their general population.
Speaking of positions of power, were there any people in power who fought back?
So there were definitely upstanders through all different types of, from the farmer who hid someone in their barn all the way up to Rollo Wallenberg, who was a diplomat who was able to use his position of power to get papers or to save Jewish people. There were people in different governments in exile or people in the governments in the United States who were saying, we do need to accept refugees. We do need to bomb the railroad tracks into Auschwitz. They didn't necessarily get the way that they wanted, but there were all different types of people in every position that recognized that what was going on was wrong and that they were going to do what they could to stop it.
And one final question. Should we, moving forward from the lesson we take from the Holocaust, how do we stop something like this from happening again, as we can see the signs that something might occur?
Right, so we study history so we can make parallels between what has already happened and what might happen today. So we learn about the steps, the preconditions.
Yes.
We learn, we don't just jump to, genocide, right?
Yeah.
Like we can look at, there's different stages, there's 10 stages to genocide. So we
The
have to,
pyramid.
right, so the pyramid of hate. So we have these resources that we can apply to situations today. So the first thing is we need to be informed, we need to know what to look for, we need to learn things like anti-Semitic language. We need to be able to point that out. And essentially, when you see it happening, we can't just say, it'll correct itself. It's not that big of a deal. If something feels wrong, chances are it is wrong.
So, if something minute is happening, just lesson of the Holocaust to be, if something bad has happened to a group of people, even minutely, do not wait for it to get better, because there's a good chance that it just might not. So that's just a lesson. Be the person to step up. Be the rebel.
Individuals can make a difference.
Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you for having me.